Channel aired a documentary, The Lost Tomb of Jesus, produced by James Cameron, the Oscar-winning director of Titanic. Cameron and Simca Jacobovici, the film's director, claimed to have discovered the tomb of Jesus and his family. They also claimed to have found evidence that Jesus had a son with, guess who? Mary Magdalene, the Tower of the Flock, and that he didn't physically ascend to heaven. If you replace the letter T of tomb with a B, you get bomb. And that's what Tomb of Jesus did. It bombed. The tomb came in fourth in the week's top 10 cable shows for adults 18 to 49 years old, behind World Wrestling and an airing of the movie The Bourne Supremacy. Maybe they should have had Matt Damon dressed in tights play Jesus. Lawrence Stager, the Durant Professor of Archaeology of Israel at Harvard, said the documentary was, quote, exploiting the whole trend that caught on with the Da Vinci Code. One of the problems is there are so many biblically illiterate people around the world, he said, that they don't know what is real judicious assessment and what is some of us in the field, or what some of us in the field call fantastic archaeology, unquote. William Deaver, who is the dean of biblical archaeology among U.S. scholars, said, quote, I'm not a Christian, I'm not a believer, I don't have a dog in this fight. I just think it's a shame the way this story is being hyped and manipulated, unquote. In a Ted Koppel special that followed the tomb, which was really more like a firing squad with Jacobovici and Dr. James Taylor sitting like ducks, the frisky Deaver called it, quote, archaeoporn, unquote. A visibly stunned Jacobovici looked at the dean and said, quote, I don't watch porn, so I don't know what you're talking about, unquote. Something went wrong. Before the show, Google News had nearly 1,000 hype articles in all the world's leading sites on the tomb and its tantalizing proposal. After, there were less than 10 articles even commenting on it. First, it was a big deal. Then it wasn't. There was no debate about it after the show. There was just dead silence. Here today to discuss the subject of the tomb of Jesus and more with us is Lawrence Gardner. He first wrote about the alleged tomb of Jesus in his 2005 book, The Magdalene Legacy. Did he miss an opportunity to make a sensational find? Or, when he cast his eagle eyes upon it, did he pass? If so, why? Lawrence, welcome to Dreamland.
Well, hello there, William. That's quite a summary. I hadn't heard what had happened after the showing.
Absolutely nothing happened. So it's great to talk with you about it. I really appreciate it, especially considering your perspective. By the way, did the show air in the UK?
No. I think it probably will. It's mooted that it'll be on our Channel 4, one of our independent stations, but there's been absolutely no publicity about it yet. I mean, if there is, it's minor and I haven't seen it. It's not been trailers on the television or anything like that. But, I mean, it's not surprising, really, because we had it all. We had a similar documentary here on exactly the same subject 11 years ago.
This show was radioactive. Why was it, do you think, that it bombed so radioactively, Lawrence? What's up with this? What was missing from this presentation?
I'm not really sure. I've not seen the Discovery documentary. I've plowed through the website that they had up front about it, and, well, quite frankly, I didn't see anything new there at all. I mean, there was nothing that we haven't seen before. Remember, this was a discovery that was made back in 1980, and it came to public attention here with television and newspaper articles in 1996, Easter time, and it was said, done, dusted, and fell from the face of the news within days, mainly because they didn't make of it what Jacobovici and Cameron tried to make of it. They simply said, this is kind of interesting. I don't know why it would have bombed right now in America, because it did seem to me in the run-up that what was happening here was that they were taking advantage of the fact that the original show that we had here probably wasn't shown in America, and therefore it might have been a new thing entirely for an American audience, on the basis of which they probably thought it would gain big ratings. But as with all things of this sort, I mean, people fall into three categories. There is a large percentage, and I would suspect in America, maybe even a majority, who would take absolutely no notice and would denounce the concept from the start. at the other end of the scale, of course, you've got all of those people that would look for anything to perhaps discredit one religion or another, and this would have been good subject matter, but wouldn't necessarily have meant that they want to watch it because they weren't interested really. And in the middle, of course, you've got a whole load of people who couldn't care less one way or the other. Mm-hmm. So on that basis, it seems to me that on thinking about it in hindsight, the chances of a really big audience rating were probably pretty low before it went on.
Mm-hmm. Lawrence, we're going to have you back on Dreamland soon to talk with Jim Mars about your book, The Shadow of Solomon. If it's okay, I'd like to spend our time today talking about a few of the anomalies that were brought forward in the tomb of Jesus, because there were some very interesting points in that presentation, and also in the book, the companion book, the Jesus Family Tomb. One of the things that leapt off the page to me were some of the assumptions that were made. One thing that Amos Kloner, for example, was widely reported as saying was that this could not possibly be the Jesus Family Tomb. Why? Because everyone knows Jesus was poor. Is this true? Was Jesus just a poor son of a lower class family, a hip from the sticks who came to Jerusalem to thumb his nose at Roman authority, or is Amos Kloner making this up?
I don't know. I mean, what Kloner's doing here, and what we have to respect, of course, is that, he is the Jerusalem district archaeologist. He's very well qualified in his field. I don't know that makes him an historical expert on biblical history or whatever, certainly Christian history, because he's Jewish anyway. So we have to let him off of that. No, there is nothing, actually, that I've ever found in the Bible or in any original text that suggests that Jesus' family was poor. I mean, it doesn't even come up one way or the other, so they might have been, or they might have been enormously rich. What tends to be the case is that this assumption of poverty comes from the fact that we do have in our modern English language Bible translations, and certainly those in other languages that have been translated from the English, this notion that Jesus was a carpenter. And it's from that, I think, that we get the impression that it was a lowly family. His father was a carpenter and he was a carpenter. But in actual fact, when one looks at the original texts which were translated in 1611 from the Greek and look at earlier other references in Aramaic and whatever, we don't find the word carpenter at all. What we find is the word tekton, which is a Greek word. It derives from the Semitic word nagar in older texts, and in both cases, what it refers to is a master craftsman, a craftsman of some sort. Now, what we find is that that's a word that could possibly have been attributed to somebody like a cabinet maker or a master builder, but it could equally have meant a learned scholar of some sort. They used to use the tekton name for teachers that we would today classify as professors in our universities. And so the family, could lay anywhere within that. Jesus' father and Jesus were masterly scholars, and that's really all that it meant. The carpenter was simply, I guess, a sort of English translation. Well, what's a craftsman? Oh, a carpenter, that'll do. We'll put that in. And it seems to be the way that that's happened. But for Kloner to stipulate that it was a poor family and this is a reason why it couldn't have been there too, and I don't see that that's correct or not. I mean, the point that I find from the film is that it certainly didn't prove, and it never could prove, that it was the tomb of Jesus. But on the other hand, there's no way that anybody could prove that it wasn't the tomb of Jesus either. It just sits there as an unknown factor.
On this issue of the craftsman, which I think is a very provocative interpretation, and one that certainly wasn't brought up in either the book or the film, but would have definitely raised some additional questions. We have this issue of the engraved chevron and circle symbol over the entrance to the tomb. It's claimed by some scholars that this is not consistent with that of the time of Jesus. Have you seen the photos of that?
Oh, yeah, I've got photos of that, and I've seen others. In fact, it's not unique. Quite what it may symbolize, if it symbolizes anything, I wouldn't want to hazard a particular guess at. But in the Ossuary Directory and other places, it's described as a gable carving. That's what they call it, and it turns up on other tombs of the sort. It was the case, of course, that although this tomb was unearthed from below ground, so to speak, when they were excavating, originally it was an above-ground structure. The cave was an above-ground cave, and a doorway entrance was cut, as it normally is, from what might have been an original hole of some sort into a square-looking doorway, over which it was pretty common to simulate a type of roof by putting on what they called a gable carving, a sort of apex thing above it. Now, that's the official interpretation, and that's how it's listed in Ossuaries, Rectories, and other excavational books. Whether that's 100% true or not, I don't really know. I wasn't there at the time. It does seem to me, however, to look at these things, they are not always, and in fact very rarely, indicative of a perfect right angle of any sort. That, they're just an apex shape which might be right-angled or might not be, and they're slightly curved. In the case of the Talpiot one, it's got a curvature to it anyway. So I don't know. It's an intriguing thing, and I've heard a number of people suggest that it means this or that, particularly with the circle below it, which is also carved into the stone, and maybe it did have a symbolic significance, but I wouldn't like to, stake any big claim on that.
And so you wouldn't write home and say that this is the symbol of a royal family, or perhaps you would even subscribe to the idea as put forward by Dr. Britt Minshaw that this was a circus-like sideshow symbol that was put there by worshipers or entrepreneurs around the 8th or 9th century. We just simply don't know, do we?
Honestly, we don't know. It could have been symbolic of, I don't know why it would be symbolic of royalty particularly, but given that the problem here is it's like the names on the ossuaries, and even the combination of names on the ossuaries, even the fact that there are 71 inscriptions that have been discovered as Jesus, with Jesus' name, and some of those Jesus, son of Joseph, in the same tombs that have Mary. This Talpiot tomb is in no way particularly unique. And the same goes with that gable carving. It's not unique. It's not as if we can point to it and say, aha, this is different from the rest. It's different to some, it's different to many, but it's not different to the rest. There are others that have the same type of carving above. Sometimes they have a sort of circular thing underneath. Sometimes it's a rosette. Sometimes it's a sort of shield design. And goodness knows what that meant. What one could say, oh, yes, of course, the circle is kind of representative of, the symbol for light or something like that. Well, yes, it was. But, there's probably a house down my street with a circle carved in its gables. It probably isn't a symbol for light. It just is a good shape to put there. So I don't know. You're right. We simply don't know. I wouldn't like to, as you know from my work, I don't like to underestimate anything, but I don't want to underline things that don't have some sort of evidence going for them. And the problem here is that there's no real evidence. There's nothing documented. It's a very, very interesting find.
Lawrence, we have to catch a break. When we come back, I want to talk about how we present evidence to scholars, some of the instances in your career where you've come against some of these scholars. This is William Henry. This is Dreamland. We'll be right back.
We're doing things a little differently on our commercial break on Dreamland this week. Things are changing is the reason, and changing fast. The planet Earth is changing fast, and you're going to find more and more of these radical and negative changes around you as time goes on. And that is one of the things we are all about, not in changing the impossible because we can't. The aim of this website and the aim of this program is change. It is about learning what a being of light is, what resurrection is, and how we can use this information in ourselves in order to live through, beyond, and above the negative earth changes that are coming to us. This site is going to become a center of intention which we can all share over the next few years. This weekend, I will be chatting, and Ann will be chatting live with our subscribers from 10 to 11 on Saturday morning. That's Saturday the 10th. And for you subscribers who are listening to this later and missed that, you can always read the transcripts of the chat. They are up permanently in the subscribers section. Upcoming in the chat room will be Lawrence Gardner. So do subscribe to keep this all going. We are featuring this week the Atomic Christ, William Henry's book on FDR and Nicholas Roerich's journey to Tibet to find out what they knew about beings of light. And there's a great sale on in his store as well. Plus, there is a lot about the electromagnetic nature of the soul in the key. Amazing stuff. So if you want to start to learn about this, then those books would be very good places to start. And why do we need to learn? What exactly is happening and what is changing? Well, we're moving from the age of Pisces to the age of Aquarius. And whoever laid these calendars down and the zodiac down, they knew what they were doing. The age of Pisces, during this age, mankind grew into a great big fish in the water. The water was the water of the life of the earth, and it sustained us flawlessly for thousands of years. Now it's failing because we've gotten to be too big. We are, in other words, at the point of birth. We are so big now that we must be born into the wider universe. We are not going to be building rocket ships to go to other stars. It doesn't happen that way. That isn't what it's about. There is a rocket ship, though. It is in your own heart, your own mind, and your own soul. And this website and this radio program is about how to get that rocket going so that once Aquarius pours the waters out and the little fish ends up lying on his side on the dry land, unable to breathe anymore, you will still be able to participate in the miracle of being in a whole new way.
This is William Henry. This is Dreamland. We're continuing with Lawrence Gardner. Lawrence, in this Ted Koppel special that followed the airing of The Lost Tomb of Jesus, they had kind of a star chamber set up where on the one hand you had Jacobo Vici and you had Dr. James Tabor. On the other side, they had two different groups of scholars that came in. The first group came in and they basically said, we don't care what you have to say. We're not going to listen to you. Nothing you can tell us is going to shake our faith. It's not going to change our mind in any regard. They just basically accused them of putting on a circus show. The balance between education and entertainment can be a tricky one. Talk about that and what you've experienced in your over decade of book publishing in this area.
I think the big secret of it, if there is a secret, and I didn't recognize it as that until it hit me a few years afterwards, is to try and approach the subject, whatever it might be, historically or religiously, in some sort of central manner. I mean, giving the impression that really you're not trying from the outset, as this documentary did, to prove something in particular. Mm-hmm. So the work that I've done has really always been on that basis. You know, I mean, it like this, it doesn't really matter very much to me what people believe religiously, whether they're Jewish or Christian or Muslim or nothing at all. You know, that is none of my business. That's their business. So I've never seen it as my job to try and persuade anybody of anything. But what I do know is that in terms of history, religious history comes under that banner. We are never, ever looking at what we can determine to be the truth. It might be, but it might not be. I mean, the word history in the dictionary is described simply as a record of events. And so it's the record that is the history, not the truth of the event. And records vary. Even in daily news stories today, you'll find that one newspaper will report the same story as another, but its slant will be different because it maybe supports the other political party or something of that sort. And so what one tries to look for is evidence. And, of course, the best evidence is documentary evidence. And if one is talking about religious history, of course, the best documentary evidence to present is the Church's own documentary evidence.
Mm-hmm.
And in essence, that's really what I've attempted to do. And when I've written in the past, and I suppose I've got better at it. You know, if you look back at my early work, I wasn't so adept at doing this, but I've got better at it. The way to do it is simply to present the information and leave, in fact, I mean, a way out for discussion by everybody and anybody, but no way for the church to challenge what might be perceived as my personal opinion, because it isn't. It's simply what somebody there at the time wrote and what was generally believed. And that applies, of course, to the Christian Gospels themselves, you know, or to the stories of Queen Boudica, for example. It doesn't matter. Somebody wrote this stuff and believed it at the time, and it was general knowledge. Now, if I find, as I have found, early documentation going back to the late 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, and 5th centuries, all discussing the family of Jesus and descendants in the line and whatever, and if I can see that comes out of the Roman environment and comes out how actually documents that are held in the Vatican, not which I found in a cupboard of mine, then I can legitimately present that and say, well, look, what we are taught now is this, but what was written at the time was that. Mm-hmm. And it isn't beyond challenge as the truth, but it is beyond challenge as a fact of documentary evidence.
One of my pet peeves when watching documentaries like The Tomb of Jesus is the hokey way they portray Jesus and Mary Magdalene. And in fact, Ted Koppel commented on the recreations in the film. There was a very critical exchange. In fact, Koppel said, visual imagery carries a certain power that the spoken word does not. You have made recreations in which you show Jesus and Mary Magdalene. You don't say that it happened, but by depicting it, you lend a power to that theory that it wouldn't otherwise have. Jacobovici responded by saying, my job as a filmmaker and a journalist was to tell a story, and Koppel snapped back saying, but you dramatize. I'm not sure with most newscasts that would be okay. You dramatize. Here's what I'm seeing and what I wanted to ask you about, Lawrence. At Mount Vernon, right now, in October 2006, they opened a new feature, a new film about George Washington. And what they decided there was that the old George Washington no longer appealed to the youth of America, so they created a film where they present a younger, studlier action hero, George Washington, and are calling this history.
Yes.
What is the difference between what they're doing at Mount Vernon and what Jacobovici's trying to do with Jesus and Mary Magdalene?
Well, probably nothing. I mean, we have to remember here, not only is Jacobovici an Emmy Award-winning documentary producer, but he also lined up on this one with James Cameron, who's an Oscar Award Hollywood director. So we have something really quite special going on here. We have the Hollywood brain input on this. What I find sad about it is that when you've got two personalities like that, both highly reputed, respected, in their own way, what people would expect from them is a balanced view and some honesty. But what it seems was portrayed was something as if it was scenes from a Hollywood movie, which, of course, if it's fictional, can be made up. But, we see it so many times in movies. We've seen it with Braveheart. And all of these movies that seem to attempt to portray history and get believed, I suppose, by a large number of people as if they're the filmed story of the facts, end up being totally and utterly misrepresentative. And I just wish that sometimes that they would make it clear that this is a Hollywood image of it. It's not the truth. It's not the fact. It's not even the documented history. It's a story written around something and portrayed in a way that will be entertaining. Quite often we get films like Rob Roy, for example, from a few years back, and from the beginning to the end, it was a thoroughly enjoyable film. I had no complaints about the production at all. But it wasn't about Rob Roy. There's nothing in it that was anything similar to Rob Roy's historically documented story. And they could have called it anything. They called it Hamish Macdonald. It wouldn't have mattered. And I think sometimes what Hollywood attempts to do is to play to the market really by adding names to things that aren't necessarily what it's about, King Arthur or whatever it might be. And in this case, it's done the same thing. It's shown images of Jesus and Mary Magdalene. I've not seen it, but it would, by implication, have led people to believe, subliminally maybe, almost as if, well, there was a camera at the time and this is what really happened, and it has to be, portrayed with some honesty because it's coming from Cameron and Jacobovici, and I think that's unfair, actually. I mean, as entertainment, it's great, but I think it's unfair to mislead in that way.
In the book and also in the film, Lawrence, their evidence suggests that Jesus would have been a woolly-haired Jew, as opposed to the Aryan stud that you see throughout America in paintings and portraits. In the film, they portrayed Mary Magdalene. She was really pretty cute, actually. She looked really good. And so another thing we never see in these documentaries is an accurate recreation of the Temple of Solomon. Why do you suppose that is, too? Do we just not know what went on at the Temple of Solomon? And this is going to lead us into our next segment where we talk about the actual practice of ossuaries and what the original Judeo-Christians believed. Paint us a picture before the break here, Lawrence, of Solomon's Temple as it existed at the time of Jesus and Mary Magdalene.
Well, Solomon's Temple as it existed at the time of Mary Magdalene would have been the Herodian Temple, which was in fact the sort of second and a half construction, I suppose. Solomon's original temple was there. That was demolished. The Jews returning out of captivity from Babylon built another temple, which, according to the archaeology, appears to have been bigger somewhat than the first. You've got Seleucid kings extending back. You've got Syrians destroying part of it again. And you've got the Hasmonean priests extending it yet again. And then when we get to King Herod's time, we find something quite different. It is extended beyond belief. And reading Flavius Josephus, I mean, he uses words like amazing. He's awestruck. It's more than impressive. And in fact, in size, I forget the actual acreage, but he tells us in Josephus, it was far bigger than the Acropolis at Athens. I mean, it was the biggest construction in the world at that time, and probably in terms of ground coverage, I'm not sure today, but it would be close to it. It was enormous. However, although we have in the Bible, in the books of Kings and Chronicles, some description of the original Temple of Solomon, in terms of its measurements, its interior design, its front portico, its pillars, its courtyard, and whatever, there is nothing in the Bible, certainly, to describe what the Herodian temple looked like in the Gospel era. All we have are Josephus' descriptions of it. I mean, there may be others, but that's the only one I know. And he really can't seem to get beyond using the words like fantastic and amazing, so he never actually gets down to describing it properly at all. And so, who knows whether we'll ever get a proper image of it. Who would know? I mean, I suppose any image would be good as long as it was authentically of the period.
Right.
But there's no way to prove it. There were no photographs taken at the time.
Lawrence, we're going to take a quick break. When we get back, I'd like to talk with you about the ossuary ritual that the early Judeo-Christians practiced. This is William Henry. This is Dreamland. We'll be right back. This is William Henry. This is Dreamland. We're continuing with Lawrence Gardner. Lawrence, in the book, The Jesus Family Tomb, it's noted that the practice of second burial belonged only to the Jews of the Second Temple period. They wrapped the dead in shrouds, placed them in tombs, and returned a year later to rebury the bones in limestone ossuaries. What are your thoughts on that practice?
Yeah, it's referred to as the Second Temple period. In actual fact, it seems to have started a little before not before the Second Temple, but before the Herodian Temple. So we're moving back probably into the late 1st, even 2nd century BC, and coming through to the destruction of Jerusalem and the collapse of everything in AD 70. So it's sort of within, let's say it's within a period of 100 years or so. Now, again, the only way to prove statements of the sort that you just mentioned is there are two ways of doing it. One either finds archaeological relics to prove a point and then dates them, hopefully correctly, and we're getting better at that, I suppose, as time goes on. Or the other thing is to find recorded evidence in the way of maybe pictures or something of that sort. The difficulty with that aspect of it is, although there are numerous pictures that emerged, certainly from the 2nd century, from the Christian community in terms of gospel time period practice, there's nothing really from the Jewish community. You know, they didn't portray people. It was pretty simple. So there are no really interesting pictures that come out of that period at all. It was forbidden to create images. And man was in the likeness of God, and you couldn't portray God, so you couldn't draw pictures of people. And it's a shame, because from Egypt and Mesopotamia and everywhere else, we have a lot of relics that give us pictures of what went on at the time, even from the most ancient times in 3rd and 4th millennium Mesopotamia. We have these, but we have nothing from that period. What we know, and I say we advisedly because I'm not an archaeologist, but what archaeologists know is that the only ossuaries they've discovered come from that era. Mm-hmm. So it is pinpointed that ossuary practice was within that time frame. Now, whether something will be found either side of that at any time, I don't know, but it seems to apply to that Second Temple period.
And it seems like such an unusual practice. I mean, and I wonder, I marvel at the pun between the word ossuary and Osiris, and I wonder if these early Judeo-Christians were somehow doing research in Egypt, learned about the story of Osiris being placed in a box or a tomb and raising from the dead, and if they're mimicking something they learned elsewhere.
It could be. I mean, the thing about Egypt, or all that we seem to be told at any time, is that the important pharaohs and high priests and people were mummified. So we learn a lot about mummification. We don't learn a great deal about ordinary Egyptian burial practice. And when they have found the remains of people who weren't mummified, they seem to have been buried in a pretty ordinary way. However, you can rule nothing out, because you can never draw a line underneath all this, because if you do and you make a positive statement, then next week something is sure to be discovered to make you wrong. Right. So it could have been, William. I mean, it could have been a practice from somewhere else. A lot of the Jewish practices stemmed either from Mesopotamia, which this doesn't seem to be part of, or from Egypt, which many of their writings come from. I mean, lots of writings come from Egypt, certainly in the Bible, Proverbs of Solomon and whatever. These are all Egyptian things originally. And certain elements of Canaanite ritual, tradition, and customs moved into Jewish practice. So that it ended up a little bit of a hodgepodge, really, a sort of state of Palestine-Israel type Judaism that moved to modern-day society. But the ossuary practice was weird. I mean, I've often wondered why they would do it. What they would do on death is to spend quite a bit of time, working with the deceased. They would wash and clean the body thoroughly. And this was quite a family thing. They would do all this. The priest would pray and do his bit at the thing. They would then oil the body and rub oils and liniments into it. They would then perfume it with various herbs and spices and things. And so they went to a lot of trouble, seemingly, one would imagine, to try and create an environment where that body had a lifetime ahead of it, that perhaps it would remain not mummified, but in a good state for a long while. However, what they then did was to wrap it, leave it on a stone shelf in a cave, or these sort of big tomb areas that they had. And it seems about a year later, when they unwrapped it, it was pretty much nothing more than bones. And that's a little bit odd, I find, because even a body laid in earth, just dug into plain earth, a year later, still has a bit more going for it than just bones. And yet this one is treated, washed, cleaned, and wrapped in linen, and yet it ended up being more than bones. So I suspect within this process of cleaning and oiling and whatever, there was something else that they were doing which was maybe enabling the body to rot quite quickly. So that in a year's time they would unwrap it, and then there's another ceremony, more prayers and this sort of thing, and they would gather all the bones together and sort of stack them neatly. Sometimes they left the skull with them, and sometimes they separated it entirely for a different shelf. And then they put these bones into these ossuaries, which were made of limestone mortar. They were sort of molded things, or clay sometimes they were made from, and then put them into the proper sepulchre on a shelf or in a niche, or sometimes they stacked them, and that was the permanent place. And so what we have is, in the end, something which appears to achieve no more than space saving.
Huh. You know, in the
if you're
Jesus
going to put the
family
body in an
tomb,
above-ground tomb, a bunch of ossuaries is better than a big coffin, so they've achieved that, but quite what the true purpose was behind it religiously, I don't know.
In the Jesus family tomb, they note that it was the early followers of Jesus who practiced this burial. They called themselves Ebionites, or the poor, as well as the Nazarenes. Who were these Nazarenes, Lawrence, and what happened to them?
Well, the Ebionites is
Ebionites, pardon me.
It's a corruption, in effect, of the word Ebionim, which was an Aramaic term, and it was used by the Essene community at Qumran. In fact, they referred to themselves as the Ebionim. And in Christian terms, it was used mockingly in later times. Even Jesus was accused by the early church of Rome of being a practitioner such as the Ebionim and the Nazarenes who followed the wrong religion. So Jesus was actually accused by the Church of Rome for following the wrong religion. They said he was seemingly too Jewish for us. And that's why Jesus got knocked out of Christianity for quite a long period of time in the early days. But the Ebionim, it actually translates, as I'm told, to mean the poor, or poor ones. It doesn't really matter which, it's the same thing. However, it has nothing to do, never did have anything to do with them actually being poverty-struck. What actually happened was that through the community structure, as one went through degrees and moved towards the hierarchy, and within that process moved into various aspects of its priesthood, in accordance with learning and being instructed in what they called the way. You've heard of the way, most people have. It was their form of the religion. It was called the way. And as one approached the latter stages of the way, one became classified Ebionim. And what happened then was a little bit like monkish practice in the Christian church, I suppose. At that stage, to fully commit themselves to the study of the way, they had to give up ownership of all personal property. So what happened was that the man might have started off being rich, poor, or whatever, but at that stage, whatever property he had was his ownership of it was given up, and he became an Ebionite, a poor one.
Lawrence, we have to take a quick break. When we come back, I want to ask you about Mariamne and the Gospel of Philip. This is William Henry. This is Dreamland. We'll be right back. This is William Henry. This is Dreamland. We're continuing with Lawrence Gardner. Lawrence, Jacopovici pulls in Harvard professor Francois Bovand, who says he believes quite rightly that in a 14th century copy of a 4th century text, the Greek name Mariamne might be a reference to Mary Magdalene. What are your thoughts on that possibility?
Anything's possible.
Okay.
I don't know the text that is mentioned here, so I have no idea. But the fact is that the name Mariamne,
which is one of the names on the ossuaries, I should say.
That's right, yeah. It's also written Mariamne, Amne, which was the name of King Herod's wife, one of King Herod's wives. and in Hebrew it's Miriam. In Greek terms, although Mariamne itself is Old Greek, in Greco-Egyptian terms it became Mary. And so this name, Mary, Mariam, Miriam, whatever, is all the same. And so a name Mariamne turning up, Miriam, could just as easily be Mary Magdalene as any other Mary. What we do know is that in a list of possibilities, in terms of all ossuaries and all other inscriptions from that era, the most common of all female names was Mary. Whether it was written as Mariamne in Greek or Miriam in Hebrew or however it was written, it was the most common name. The mistake that I heard, and again, I haven't seen it, but I did hear that on the program, the point was made that the inscription reads Mariamne e Mara.
Right.
Which it actually does. And from that, somehow, it was determined that as distinct from Mariamne on its own, Mariamne e Mara meant Mary Magdalene. And
the master.
That, yeah, absolute tosh. It doesn't even mean the master. In fact, all one has to do is to look at the Talpiot register, a Talpiot register for these inscriptions, and it's in the Palestinian, it's in the Jewish ossuaries register, it's in the ossuaries directory, and at all stages the translation of that is there, and it's always identical, and it has nothing to do with that at all. Mara was a contraction of the name that actually, in a Greek form, was written Martha. It doesn't mean the master. The word Mara or Martha meant lady, as in a lady.
As a lady, right.
And E, in the middle, meant or. Alternatively, it could mean alternatively. And what it did not mean was Mariamne, also known as the master, which is the way it was portrayed. What it meant was Mary or Martha, Mariamne or Mara. So obviously this woman had two names or was known by two names. But in actual fact, the names are the same name almost. You know, you're really saying she's Mary, known as the lady.
Bavon
so
said
that's about all it means. So that was a total misrepresentation.
Bavon said that she, quote, she likely was a great teacher who even inspired her own sect of followers called Mariamnes, who existed from around the 2nd to the 3rd century, unquote. So I went and looked in the Acts of Philip, which you can get online, and I found this really kind of striking line in the text. I wanted to read it to you and get your reaction. It says, quote, they stripped and searched the apostles for charms and pierced Philip's ankles and thighs and hung him head downward, and Bartholomew they hung naked by the hair. And they smiled on each other, the Roman persecutors, that is, as not being tormented. But Mariamne, on being stripped, became like an ark of glass, full of light and fire, and everyone ran away. Have you ever heard anything as strange as that Mariamne, on being stripped, became like an ark of glass, full of light and fire, and everyone ran away?
Remarkable. No, I haven't. What text is this?
This is the Acts of Philip. This is the text that...
the Acts of Philip, right, yeah.
Yeah. The one that...
No. I mean, it's impossible to know what lies behind these things. It doesn't seem to matter who you look at, you know, what sainted figure or whatever from those times. All sorts of miraculous events surround them. And I was doing a study of St. George just last week for a television company, and it's incredible. St. George died 5 times, and he went through, it describes the things that were done to him. You know, he had boiling lead poured into his mouth, and his eyes were peeled, and all of these things, and in the end, he was saved and came back to life again. And so these sainted figures are surrounded by these stories. However, that doesn't mean that there isn't something at the back of them. In some instances, you know, the church didn't make up every single piece of, you know, fantastic literature that we read. What it seemed to do is to embellish greatly and exaggerate something which was there as a nub in the first place. And, you know, Mary Magdalene, you know, clearly when one reads Gospels such as that of Philip and Thomas and others, I mean, she comes forward, Pistis Sophia, for example, the Askew Codex, she was clearly extremely prominent and influential in that apostolic group. I mean, to the extent that she, you know, the men had a bit of a problem with her because, you know, they didn't like the idea that there was a woman who had some sort of sway and influence over her. And so certainly she was different. And in the Gospel, I think it's in Philip, Jesus actually calls her thou of the pure light.
Mm.
Now that's interesting when tied into what you just quoted from the Acts of Philip, you know, thou of the pure light. I mean, it's sort of intriguing. There was clearly something about this woman which was in some way transcendent. I don't know what it would have been, but I mean, she was certainly special in some way. Clearly, I mean, undoubtedly of a high priestly class. Very knowledgeable, very educated, and was influential, but got really sidestepped in the Gospels that were chosen for the New Testament.
And the reason I'm so intrigued by the statement in the Acts of Philip about Mary Magdalene becoming pure light, we might describe it, or the ark of light the ark glass full of light and fire, and that terrified people, was we have a description, or we're told rather, that the resurrection of Jesus happened. This is not something we can prove or disprove through archaeological or historical methods. It's really not something that the faithful or even care to question. They just accept that it happened.
Yes. Yeah.
How do we know it happened? Because the Bible says it did. Why do we believe it happened? Because those who preach from the Bible tell us that it happened. But my question is, respectfully, what happened when it happened? Have you considered that question, Lawrence?
Yes, I have many times. What strikes me as a little odd about it is that its biblical representation is somewhat different to the way that it is portrayed in church teaching. So we have to understand that, and that's the case in many, many things. You know, what we are taught is not necessarily what it says in the New Testament. The odd thing about the ascension, as it's called, is that the ascension is not mentioned in the Bible at all. The word doesn't get used. But there are two stories which tell us something kind of similar. And at the end of a couple of the Gospels, and I'm not sure off the top of my head, I think it's Luke's one of them, and another, following the crucifixion and the resurrection sequence, Jesus has been to his friends, and Thomas has touched him, and we all know that he's alive and real and well, and they go off on this trip. And there are two stories. One is the supper at Emmaus, which after he was resurrected, he's got this supper, and so we have that story. And another story is a fishing trip, where he's on a fishing trip. Now, between those two stories, he ascends to heaven. On the road to somewhere, he ascended to heaven. And then the next thing, I forget which way round it is, but the next thing, he's on a fishing trip with the apostles. So that's kind of strange. And then we move from there, and we travel through what chronologically, following the sequence within the New Testament, is about 6 months as a period. We follow through about 6 months, and we get to the item in the Acts of the Apostles, and then it tells us the same thing there again, but in totally different circumstances. This time there are people around him, and the man in white appears, and the fellow called the Cloud is there, and he takes Jesus off to the kingdom of heaven. And then afterwards, again, a little while after, Jesus sort of says, well, that's okay, you'll be seeing me again in Samaria. And then later, we follow it through, and a bit later on, he's with them by the lake in Samaria. And so the odd thing is that whatever happened twice, on two different occasions 6 months apart, in ascending to heaven, either was something which he was something which he did and came back from. I mean, on looking at the Dead Sea Scrolls and other literature, ascending to heaven actually is used in some cases to describe actually initiation into the priesthood. You ascend to heaven, you are initiated into the priesthood, which of course Jesus never was before that time. And then when we go to the book of Hebrews, St. Paul's epistle to the Hebrews, he actually describes that at that time, when Jesus was finally and ultimately admitted to the priesthood, there was a problem, because he was born into the line of Judah, which was a line of kings. The Levitical line was the line for priesthood. Jesus was not part of that line, and to accommodate him within the priesthood of the kingdom of heaven, the law had to be changed. And so it seems to me, on a purely mundane sort of level, that what is being described here in terms of Jesus ascending to heaven, this is after the resurrection, is his admission into the community priesthood. Now that's how it works historically. That's how it works in a very matter-of-fact way, and there doesn't seem to be much doubt about that when you apply the terminology that was used at the time. Mm-hmm. But again, going back to Mary Magdalene, and I mean, even today, certain things about certain people make them very special. Jesus was obviously one of these very special people. And in those terms, we can go back to the oldest texts and we can come through to quite recent writings. You know, there are certain people who seem to have different ways of manifesting. And I don't understand it. I don't pretend to understand it. But there is a sort of transcendence. This could have been part of the story as well. Mm-hmm. But what we end up with is a Jesus that really we can sort of follow him through the Acts of the Apostles. He's in Damascus, he's in Samaria, he's here, he's there. And we don't actually get to the point where he dies. But clearly, apart from a transcendence, I mean, we're not presuming here, I don't think, that actually as a body of bones and whatever, he sort of ascended up into heaven. I mean, it was said that the cloud took him to the kingdom of heaven, but the cloud at that time, as given in the scrolls, was the leader of the pilgrims of the Essene community. It was the high priest of the patriarchal structure was called the cloud, and that was just Exodus imagery from the time that the cloud led the Israelites out of Egypt. And so the cloud is a person in that respect. It's not a cloud in the sky. So there's a mixture here, I think, of something very mundane, and something very earthly, and something very secular. But along with it, there has to be something quite spiritual riding alongside it. Otherwise, why is Jesus? Why was he at that particular time set apart as being so special, so different? A leader with enigmatic powers, really, to claim following. So I don't know what the answer to that is. I don't know what the ascension in spiritual terms means. I can see what it means in terms of ordinary mundane history. But clearly at some stage, I suppose, that, the physical body must have died and must have been buried somewhere, and it's claimed that it was in India, it's claimed that it was here, there, and all over the place, and now we've got the Talpiot claim that it was, he was buried in Jerusalem. Well, okay, any one of those could be true. We don't know. There's nothing to tell us, and that's the dilemma. So what the film didn't do was to prove that it was the tomb of Jesus' family. In fact, it was so far off base that it was silly the way it was seemingly presented. But on the other hand, it didn't prove that it wasn't either. Mm-hmm. So,
well, if nothing else,
my mind is as open as it ever was.
If nothing else, it brought Lawrence Gardner back into Dreamland for a wonderful conversation. I want to thank you so much for spending this time with us today. I really appreciate it.
It's been a pleasure, William.
And we'll look forward to talking with you again soon. This is William Henry.
Thanks a lot.
This is William Henry. This is Dreamland. Next up, Linda Moulton Howe.
You're about to experience something that you just can't get elsewhere. Emmy Award-winning science reporter Linda Moulton Howe reporting on the absolute leading edge of science discovery and the true mysteries of the unknown. Don't miss her website, earthfiles.com, the one science website that tells you the secrets and gives you the facts that others dare not, earthfiles.com. This week, she's reporting on zones of fear around UFO incidents, a most unusual and chilling report. Here she is from Albuquerque, Linda Moulton Howe.
Thank you, Whitley. 40 years ago, in 1967, there was a huge UFO flap in the Ohio River Valley, including Point Pleasant, West Virginia. Residents there reported lots of unidentified aerial lights and silver discs, both day and night, along with strange flying creatures that resembled large humans with bat wings. That year, one of the most famous investigators of Earth mysteries was John Keel. He went to Point Pleasant to investigate and coined the term Mothman for the winged humanoids being seen flying in the air. John Keel wrote a book about his investigations entitled The Mothman Prophecies, published in 1976. In Chapter 7, he describes one night being on the trail of a creature with glowing red eyes who was seen by many but never photographed or caught. Keel was driving in rural country after midnight and reported, quote, "As I passed a certain point of one of the isolated roads, I was suddenly engulfed in fear. I stepped on the gas, and after yards, my fear vanished as quickly as it came. I continued to drive, eventually returning again to the same spot. And again, a wave of unspeakable fear swept over me. I drove quickly away from the place, and then I stopped, puzzled. Why would this one stretch of road produce this hair-rising effect? I turned around and slowly headed back, trying to note trees, fence posts, and other landmarks in the dark. Once again, when I reached that particular point, the hair tingled on the back of my neck, and I became genuinely afraid. When I emerged from the other side of this invisible zone, I stopped and got out of my car. The air was perfectly still. There wasn't any audible sound, not even a bird call. I walked back to the zone of fear slowly, alert for any rustle of bushes, measuring my own breathing and my own emotions. I was perfectly calm until one step too many, and I was back in the fear zone. I almost panicked and ran, but I forced myself to look around and proceed slowly. I steeled myself and walked once more through that invisible stream, scared out of my wits in transit, unquote. 13 years later, December 29, 1980, another bizarre, unidentified aerial object shaped like a bright, white, glowing diamond hovered low over the Texas highway. Driving toward it was 51-year-old Betty Cash, her friend Vicki Landrum, and Vicki's 7-year-old grandson Colby. The three could see the object shoot down a stream of reddish-orange flames at regular, fast intervals. Vicki Landrum later described it as, quote, like a diamond fire, unquote. There also was constant beeping sound coming from this strange diamond-shaped craft. And then the travelers saw dozens of helicopters circling the object. Since 1980, there has been intense controversy about whether that diamond was a U.S. top-secret military project or a vehicle from outer space somehow involved with the American government. If that big diamond-shaped craft was not made by humans, who or what was piloting it? Well, recently, a 44-year-old North Dakota resident contacted me about her own experiences with zones of fear and a large diamond-shaped aerial craft that appeared before her and her nephew, year 2003. The woman has requested that I not use her real name or exact location, so I will call her Terry Jones from southwestern North Dakota near the Badlands. Terry was born in 1962, and spent her 20s working for the Forest Service in Idaho as a firefighter and on a road survey crew. She met her husband in the mid-1980s, and they moved to a place north of Livingston, Montana, near the Bridger Mountains. By 1999, her husband accepted a job to manage a ranch at the edge of the Badlands in southwestern North Dakota. Occasionally, where she worked in the Rocky Mountains in the 1980s, Terry would come across specific zones that seemed to repel her with fear. She's smart and tough, and she was shocked while backing away from one of those zones of fear. She got the clear mental impression, an image in her mind of a small, gray, non-human entity, sensed that it was alien and that it was underground and did not want humans in its territory. She's given me permission to share some of her experiences, beginning with one in 1990 north of Henry's Lake in Idaho.
From my kitchen window, I'm looking west towards the lake. The mountains are to the north and south, and seeing this bright light up in the sky, very, very, very bright, stationary, just sitting there, too large to be a star. And I'm looking at this thinking, wow, that is a very large bright light, and it's just sitting there. How strange. Where did this come from? And as I'm sitting there looking at this light, thinking those thoughts, 3 smaller lights come shooting out of it, just as bright, but smaller, and they come out one after the other, shooting out of it, the north, disappearing behind a mountain range, going very fast.
What color?
They were just white, very bright white lights, and they were the same intensity as also, all of them, the stationary light as well as the 3 that traveled out of it. The 3 lights shot out behind the mountain range and disappeared out of sight, and I really got the feeling as though they were heading to the ground behind the mountain range. The stationary light shot straight up and disappeared. This area that these lights went into, definitely an area of the zone fear that we were talking about, where you don't go there because there's just this feeling that humans don't belong there. I've spent my life working in the woods, backpacking in mountains. There's a few areas I've been to that felt the same way, kind of an overwhelming fear of dread. Although my curiosity back, I saw these lights travel back in there, and I know they must have landed because of the angle that they were shooting down. They were kind of definitely heading straight towards the ground, it looked like to me.
There are areas that seem to be almost marked by zones of fear that humans sense that they're not supposed to go into them.
Yeah, I felt that feeling as though this was a bad energy area, negative feeling, and humans didn't belong there.
Let's go into what you've come to suspect might be behind these zones of fear because of experiences that you've had.
The very first experience I had with that feeling, definitely at that time there was a prophetic sense that it was an alien energy. That's the only way I can describe it. The very first time I ever felt it was actually in Wyoming, northwest of the town of DuBois, Wyoming, in a very remote wilderness area. And I was with my boyfriend at that time hiking. There was a 10,000-foot peak there we climbed to the top of, and we were climbing down the back side of it and I got into this area where I just got really scared, really negative energy area. What is it, you know? And I'm sitting there feeling this energy and feeling scared and nervous. It was the first time I'd felt this in the backcountry. That a gut-level feeling was alien. And at that time I hadn't had any experience with seeing lights or anything, but I couldn't get out of the area fast enough.
What year was this?
That was back in the mid-'80s, probably.
Did any impression come into your mind when you felt that overwhelming fear?
No, just that I needed to get out of there as soon as possible, that it wasn't a good place to be.
But why do you think back then that you linked to extraterrestrials?
It was just a feeling that it was just an alien energy, mechanical almost. Does that sound strange?
Mechanical and not human.
Yeah.
And you had lived with intuitive senses through most of your life?
Yeah, I've had a lot of psychic experiences and dreams that have come true and that sort of thing.
And so your living life with intuition has reinforced that when you do feel a sense of fear or dread, that there is a reason.
Yes, absolutely. But it was here, my most intense alien encounter 4 or 5 years ago. It was on the ranch, and it was an evening. My nephew was with us at the time, and I had my 3 daughters just sitting around relaxing in the evening and having a conversation. And my nephew had grown up in California, and I knew he had never really looked at the night sky at night, and I just got this overwhelming urge to get outside and look at the stars. So we go outside, and there's this really fantastic display of northern lights going on at that time. So that was an added benefit, because he got to watch the northern lights for the first time in his life, plus see all the fantastic stars in the sky at night here on Prairie and in the Badlands of Dakota. Pretty soon there's a light cruising across the northern skyline within the northern lights, traveling through it, zigzagging back and forth. We see this, wow, UFO, look, and getting all excited. I've got 2 of my daughters outside with me. Just a mention of a UFO, they ran to the house because it scared them. So my nephew and I stayed out there. This UFO continues to travel across the northern sky in a zigzag pattern and then suddenly shoots straight down behind the horizon to the north with kind of a bright flash. And this was just another bright white light, but it was just kind of neat because here the northern lights were going on. It was just a fantastic night outside, and wow, we get to watch UFOs too. And pretty soon there's 3 lights up there, and they're all kind of dancing around in the northern lights. And this is just really a fantastic thing to watch. These 3 little lights, very bright, several miles away, I'm thinking, because in North Dakota you can see quite a ways to the horizon north of us at this time, and they're just sort of zipping around in the northern lights. And it was almost like, what were they doing? Why were they zipping around in the northern lights? Was there some reason why they were doing that? I don't know. My husband and I speculated later, well, maybe they do something with their craft, like collect negative and positive ions out of the atmosphere. Pretty soon they kind of break up, and all 3 go in different directions. One takes off to the west, one takes off to the east. They all just disappeared out of sight. And my nephew and I are just standing there like, wow, that was so cool. We're watching the sky, waiting for some of these lights to go back up, and all of a sudden, holy crap, look in the sky. I look straight up where he's looking, and there's this huge, very bright, diamond-shaped light right above us. And when I say huge, it's not like as big as the moon. It's very big, bigger than a star.
And very clearly a diamond shape, as you would draw a diamond, let's say, in school.
Very clearly a diamond shape. We both agreed to that immediately. Oh, that's diamond shape, That's weird. It's got to be a UFO, We don't have any diamond-shaped craft we know of anyway, and we're watching this diamond-shaped light right above us just in utter excitement and fascination. A few minutes have gone by, and it's just sitting there, and we're just sitting there watching it, and all of a sudden I kind of get a little nervous. It's like, maybe they're getting ready to abduct us. Maybe any minute now a team is going to come shooting out of the bottom of it, and we're going to go up. Then the minute I start feeling this fear of abduction, the craft starts moving away from us to the north, zigzagging as it goes very slowly across the sky.
Almost leaving the sachet, like, okay, you're afraid, we're going to leave?
Yeah, I definitely felt it was related to my fear. But I think the second I started feeling that, imagining abduction in my mind, the light started moving north very slowly. And then I was almost sorry that I'd felt that way, because I felt like I had chased it away. And it kind of slowly disappeared up into the sky. The light just kind of got smaller and smaller and smaller, zigzagging the whole time, and then just disappeared straight up. Within a year, I had this dream that I was discussing with you that I feel is related somehow. The dream is very clear to me, and that's why I think it wasn't just a dream. It was maybe their way of contacting me without putting fear into me. There's a part of me that believes that's true. And I was actually dreaming that I was woken up out of my sleep telepathically from this alien who had just landed on a butte near us, parked his craft on the butte, and is actually hiking down to the ranch where I live to contact me personally. And he's letting me know that he's on his way, and I can actually see him telepathically hiking along this ridge that leads down to the ranch. And I know that I have to get up and go outside and hike out a little ways behind the corrals behind the house to meet with him. I do in my dream. And I get up there and we shake hands, and there's really no verbal communication going on other than he just says, I just wanted to meet you. And he wants to shake my hand. And instantly there's this bond with this reptilian creature. I feel no threat from him. He's reptilian in the degree that he's green, scaly. But I remember silver boots on his feet, tall silver boots. And I remember he was wearing something else that was either like a shield or armor or clothing. I can't remember, but it wasn't part of his skin.
And could you see eyes, nose, and all of that?
Well, that's the thing, is that there was something about him that was human, too. That was the really odd part in the dream, is the humanness in him was putting me at ease. But he had an inner strength, like a warrior strength about him, and a kindness at the same time. And I felt very honored and privileged that he even wanted to meet me. But this is all in dream, and, dream time.
And how big was he compared to you?
He was very tall. He was well over 6 feet tall, probably between 6 and 7 feet tall.
And was he more massive in his chest and shoulder?
Yeah, he was muscular. But he was slender, too. He had very long legs, very long arms. But the arms were very beefy, but the legs were kind of long and kind of skinny.
And can you describe the scales in terms of color and size and what they look like?
I just remember he was kind of mottled, multicolored, kind of aqua, kind of dark green.
So there was blue in there as well as green?
Yeah, kind of aqua. And it seemed to me like his face, there was a definite, small snout at the end of his face that was light-colored or lighter than the rest of him.
And if you were picking a reptilian on the earth that you know that is as close to what he looked like in memory, what would that animal be?
I remember some spikes coming off him somewhere, like from the back of his head maybe, and down his spine.
If you think of an iguana or something like that?
Okay, maybe more like an iguana, yeah. To me, he was like a chameleon. It felt like his color could change to his environment. He's pretty rough-scaled, very large-scaled.
So would it be like a standing-up alligator?
Similar. But there's a lot of human about him, too. Maybe he was what they call a hybrid. I don't know. He was completely harmless, very gentle in nature, but yet he also was a great warrior, like to have him as an ally or somebody who looked out after you would be a good thing. I don't know. That's just how I felt about him.
And what residue have you had about why the reptilian is there?
Just make contact, nothing else.
But what do you think the relationship is between the reptilian being and the non-humans that you have sensed in these zones of fear?
I don't really see the connection between them. I just know that those zones of fear and the aliens that are connected to them don't have our best interest in mind.
But the reptilian does.
Yeah.
When you think of the zones of fear, what non-human comes to mind?
The grays, little short ones.
And that comes to mind because you've had interactions with them or you have sensed them?
No, I just sense them.
Do you get visual images in your mind of them?
I have, yeah, I definitely have, up in the mountains, very strongly once.
Can you explain that in detail?
Well, I live in Idaho, and I was working for the Forest Service, and for some reason we had to drive pretty far up into the mountain range to do some road surveying. I was on a survey crew at that time, pretty close to one of the mountain peaks. And I can't really explain it, but all I know is that this was gray alien territory. That was all I knew, and that we shouldn't be there. And the only reason I knew it was like gray alien is because I got a clear, definite image in my mind of gray aliens and ships landing there, and they didn't want us there.
They did not want humans there?
No.
And where exactly was that? Where were you working?
That was in Target National Forest in Idaho.
And that's on the border of?
West of Yellowstone Park.
So near Wyoming?
Mm-hmm. And near Montana, kind of up in that corner there, south of West Yellowstone.
And what year would that have been?
80s.
Now, with all these various experiences in Wyoming, in Montana, in North Dakota, Arizona, in which you have sensed zones of fear, zones of stay-out humans, can you explain what you think is behind those zones of fear, what it is exactly that wants to keep humans out?
their own personal agenda, and they don't want us part of it, and they don't want us to be aware of what that is or where they're at.
And you would place this as these little grays.
Yeah, never really connected reptilians to any of that.
Do you have any sense of what could be unfolding in the future?
I've had a premonition about this butte where he landed his craft. Someday there will be several smaller crafts hovering over this butte, and at that time there's a definite energy shift in the air. That's the only way I can describe it.
And in your mind's eye right now, if you can think of the butte and you see the image that has come into your mind before, craft over that butte?
Yeah.
Like the sky is filled with craft?
No, just like maybe 25 or 30, the air right over this butte.
And what are their shapes?
Saucer.
And the saucers are associated with which type of non-human?
Well, that's the part I'm not sure of. That has not come to me. Just there will be some kind of a contact at that time. I really don't know if it's going to be good or bad. That's the part I'm confused about.
She's confused. I'm confused. Everybody seems to be confused about agendas, motives, and this whole issue. If there are zones of fear and they are bounded by grays, their territory, and they're underground, what is the relationship between whatever the gray world is and the reptilians and the many other types that have been described in the human abduction syndrome now for at least 40 years? And realize that we have been living with this phenomena for at least half a century, and we still don't have any clear idea of agendas. But as in this case, in 2000, in the 1980s to the 2000s, and in John Keel back in the 1960s, 40 years ago, there are still these zones of fear, as if there are territories marked on this planet by some kind of invisible energy.
Linda, this dovetails very much with my own experience in especially the territoriality of it. Is I found that it was the whole thing was extremely territorial to the point that when I left upstate New York, the visitors didn't follow me when we moved to Texas. They came once or twice, but that was it. Mm-hmm. They didn't follow. And there was a real sense of territoriality. I even heard one man who was somewhat knowledgeable about this say that the area that we were in, which stretched from Woodstock, New York, down to Pine Bush, New York, was actually had a name. That the government called it the enclosure, and it was a place where all different sorts of being could be without compromise, without coming into conflict with each other. So it was very interesting. Also, these zones of fear. There's something in that. That's a very interesting report, Linda. Very fascinating. I want to thank you for this. This is quite fascinating.
Yes, and I wish I understood the implications of it all for our future.
Well, yeah, because what if it becomes all zones of fear? That'll be pleasant.
Or some kind of conflict yet to unfold having to do with territory.
Well, that could happen. I think that, just a few days ago there was another apparent UFO crash in Iran, and unless those are American spy craft that are being shot down, it would suggest something really, really strange is happening there, and that it does involve conflict. The chances of it being American spy planes are not good, and the reason I say that is that if they were, the Iranians would be putting the pieces of those planes on the news. They'd be all over the news, and they're not.
Right.
Apparently because they can't find them.
Right. And this whole issue of how many conflicts are going on at any one time. Are we humans on the surface of the earth battling while there are territorial conflicts going on with other intelligences for reasons that are not comprehensible but might affect the humans and whatever we are doing in our Earth surface battle?
Well, of course, it could be like this because there's been a war on for a long time, and we are the spoils of war, and since nobody can quite win the war, nothing ever really changes here, except maybe someone will win, in which case things would change radically. Linda Moulton Howe, it's been a pleasure and an eye-opening fascination as always. Linda's website, earthfiles.com. Don't miss
a large percentage, and I would suspect in America, maybe even a majority, who would take absolutely no notice and would denounce the concept from the start. At the other end of the scale, of course, you've got all of those people that would look for anything to perhaps discredit one religion or another, and this would have been good subject matter, but wouldn't necessarily have meant that they'd want to watch it because they weren't interested really. And in the middle, of course, you've got a whole load of people who couldn't care less one way or the other. Mm-hmm. So on that basis, it seems to me that on thinking about it in hindsight, the chances of a really big audience rating were probably pretty low before it went on.
Mm-hmm. Lawrence, we're going to have you back on Dreamland soon to talk with Jim Mars about your book, The Shadow of Solomon. If it's okay, I'd like to spend our time today talking about a few of the anomalies that were brought forward in the tomb of Jesus, because there were some very interesting points in that presentation, and also in the book, the companion book, the Jesus Family Tomb. One of the things that leapt off the page to me were some of the assumptions that were made. One thing that Amos Kloner, for example, was widely reported as saying was that this could not possibly be the Jesus Family Tomb. Why? Because everyone knows Jesus was poor. Is this true? Was Jesus just a poor son of a lower class family, a hip from the sticks who came to Jerusalem to thumb his nose at Roman authority? Or is Amos, quote, archaeoporn, unquote? A visibly stunned Jacobovici looked at the dean and said, quote, I don't watch porn, so I don't know what you're talking about, unquote. Something went wrong. Before the show, Google News had nearly 1,000 hype articles in all the world's leading sites on the tomb and its tantalizing proposal. After, there were less than 10 articles even commenting on it. First, it was a big deal. Then it wasn't. There was no debate about it after the show. There was just dead silence. Here today to discuss the subject of the tomb of Jesus and more with us is Lawrence Gardner. He first wrote about the alleged tomb of Jesus in his 2005 book, The Magdalene Legacy. Did he miss an opportunity to make a sensational find? Or, when he cast his eagle eyes upon it, did he pass? If so, why? Lawrence, welcome to Dreamland.
Well, hello there, William. That's quite a summary. I hadn't heard what had happened after the showing.
Absolutely nothing happened. So it's great to talk with you about it. I really appreciate it, especially considering your perspective. By the way, did the show air in the UK?
No. I think it probably will. It's mooted that it'll be on our Channel 4, one of our independent stations, but there's been absolutely no publicity about it yet. I mean, if there is, it's minor and I haven't seen it. It's not been trailers on the television or anything like that. But, I mean, it's not surprising, really, because we had it all. We had a similar documentary here on exactly the same subject 11 years ago.
Kloner making this up.
I don't know. I mean, what Kloner's doing here, and what we have to respect, of course, is that, I mean, he is the Jerusalem district archaeologist. He's very well qualified in his field. I don't know that makes him an historical expert on biblical history or whatever, certainly Christian history, because he's Jewish anyway. So we have to let him off of that. No, there is nothing, actually, that I've ever found in the Bible or in any original text that suggests that Jesus' family was poor. I mean, it doesn't even come up one way or the other, so they might have been, or they might have been enormously rich. What tends to be the case is that this assumption of poverty comes from the fact that we do have in our modern English language Bible translations, and certainly those in other languages that have been translated from the English, this notion that Jesus was a carpenter. And it's from that, I think, that you know, we get the impression that it was a lowly family. His father was a carpenter and he was a carpenter. But I mean, in actual fact, when one looks at the original texts which were translated in 1611 from the Greek and look at earlier other references in Aramaic and whatever, we don't find the word carpenter at all. What we find is the word tekton, which is a Greek word. It derives from the Semitic word nagar in older texts, and in both cases, what it refers to is a master craft.
This show was radioactive. Why was it, do you think, that it bombed so radioactively, Lawrence? What's up with this? What was missing from this presentation?
I'm not really sure. I've not seen the Discovery documentary. I've plowed through the website that they had up front about it, and well, quite frankly, I didn't see anything new there at all. I mean, there was nothing that we haven't seen before. Remember, this was a discovery that was made back in 1980, and it came to public attention here with television and newspaper articles in 1996, Easter time, and it was said, done, dusted, and fell from the face of the news within days, mainly because they didn't make of it what Jacobovici and Cameron tried to make of it. They simply said, this is kind of interesting. I don't know why it would have bombed right now in America, because it did seem to me in the run-up that what was happening here was that they were taking advantage of the fact that the original show that we had here probably wasn't shown in America, and therefore it might have been a new thing entirely for an American audience, on the basis of which they probably thought it would gain big ratings. But as with all things of this sort, I mean, people fall into three categories. There is
Channel aired a documentary, The Lost Tomb of Jesus, produced by James Cameron, the Oscar-winning director of Titanic. Cameron and Simca Jacobovici, the film's director, claimed to have discovered the tomb of Jesus and his family. They also claimed to have found evidence that Jesus had a son with, guess who? Mary Magdalene, the Tower of the Flock, and that he didn't physically ascend to heaven. If you replace the letter T of tomb with a B, you get bomb. And that's what Tomb of Jesus did. It bombed. The tomb came in fourth in the week's top 10 cable shows for adults 18 to 49 years old, behind World Wrestling and an airing of the movie The Bourne Supremacy. Maybe they should have had Matt Damon dressed in tights play Jesus. Lawrence Stager, the Durant Professor of Archaeology of Israel at Harvard, said the documentary was, quote, exploiting the whole trend that caught on with the Da Vinci Code. One of the problems is there are so many biblically illiterate people around the world, he said, that they don't know what is real judicious assessment and what is some of us in the field, or what some of us in the field call fantastic archaeology, unquote. William Deaver, who is the dean of biblical archaeology among U.S. scholars, said, quote, I'm not a Christian, I'm not a believer, I don't have a dog in this fight. I just think it's a shame the way this story is being hyped and manipulated, unquote. In a Ted Koppel special that followed the tomb, which was really more like a firing squad with Jacobovici and Dr. James Tabor sitting like ducks, the frisky Deaver called it